I'm telling you right now, save the tape. He's not giving $8 million to Blake Lively or the lawyers in this case.
Blake Lively's $8 million legal gamble may be falling apart. Reports say her request for attorney's fees is facing a major challenge as Justin Baldoni's legal team prepares to fight it in federal court. The judge has reportedly shown little patience with the ongoing dispute, and Blake could recover only a small portion of what she sought. Critics argue the math behind the filing doesn't make sense, pointing to claims of 6,100 billable hours in just 2 months. That figure has fueled accusations that the request was more about headlines than justice. If the numbers don't hold up, this courtroom battle could reshape the entire narrative.
In order to get at their billable hours at $8 million, they would need to have 5,000 to 6,000 staff hours across those firms in order to get to $8 million. So like that alone just proves how full of BS they are, because the math ain't mathin'.
Now, Blake Lively's latest legal move has everyone talking, and the price tag alone is turning heads. According to recent court filings, her legal team is asking the judge to award $8 million in attorney's fees, a figure many observers say is unusually high for a case like this. But it isn't just the amount that's fueling debate, it's what such a request could signal about the strategy behind the lawsuit. The filing quickly became one of the biggest talking points surrounding the case, with legal commentators questioning how the court will view such an extraordinary demand. Judge Louis Lyman, who has overseen the litigation from the start, has spent months reviewing filings, hearing arguments, and evaluating both sides. Now all eyes are on his next decision. Will the court view the request as justified, or will this bold demand become one of the biggest setbacks in the entire legal battle?
You know, this is one of those things. I keep thinking that she and her ego have been driving this litigation.
Blake Lively's $8 million legal fee request isn't just raising eyebrows, it's raising serious questions. Some legal experts believe the massive figure could simply be a negotiation tactic. Ask for an exceptionally high amount, expecting the judge to reduce it while still securing a favorable payout. That's a common strategy in litigation. But many observers argue this case is different. Throughout the proceedings, the judge has closely scrutinized every request instead of accepting numbers at face value. The court is expected to evaluate whether the fees are actually supported by the legal work performed, not just the amount being claimed. According to the filing, much of that work allegedly occurred within a narrow window between mid-January and mid-March 2025. That timeline immediately caught people's attention, with many questioning whether enough work could realistically have been completed in just 2 months to justify such an enormous fee request. As more people crunch the numbers, the biggest question isn't how much was requested, it's whether the math can survive the courtroom.
What's $8 million divided by $1,300? That's 6,100 hours of work in 3 months. I mean, that's an insane amount of money.
Blake Lively's $8 million legal fee request didn't just make headlines, it sparked a debate that could shape the outcome of the entire case. The moment the filing became public, it stopped being just another legal document and turned into one of the most closely watched developments in the lawsuit. For many people following the case, this wasn't simply about money. It became a major test of how the court would evaluate one of the largest financial requests made during the litigation. Whether the judge ultimately approves the full amount, cuts it significantly, or rejects it altogether remains entirely up to the court. But one thing became obvious immediately. Everyone started talking about the numbers. Here's why the request raised so many questions. According to Blake's filing, some members of her legal team billed at rates as high as $1,300 per hour. On its own, that's not unusual for attorneys handling high-profile litigation. Elite lawyers often charge premium hourly rates. But once legal analysts and court watchers started doing the math, the conversation changed completely. Reaching an $8 million fee request at those rates would require an enormous number of billable hours, leading many people to question whether that amount of work could realistically have been completed within the relatively short period referenced in the filing. The scrutiny intensified when those hours were translated into actual workdays. Suddenly, people weren't focused only on the headline figure. They were asking what would have needed to happen behind the scenes to justify it. Multiple attorneys, associates, paralegals, and support staff would have needed to log substantial time over a compressed timeline. That calculation quickly fueled debate over whether the requested fees accurately reflected the legal work that was actually performed or whether the numbers stretched beyond what many considered reasonable. Of course, public opinion isn't what decides the outcome. The court does. Still, from the moment the filing surfaced, the mathematics behind the request became one of the biggest talking points surrounding the lawsuit. Many legal commentators noted that attorney fee requests are generally expected to be tied directly to the work performed. Courts don't simply look at the final dollar amount. They typically examine how the total was calculated, which legal tasks were included, whether the claimed hours were reasonable, and whether every billed hour is legally recoverable under the applicable standards. That's exactly why this stage of the case matters so much. In high-profile litigation, legal teams often pursue every argument they believe could strengthen their client's position. That strategy doesn't guarantee every request will be approved. The court's responsibility is to review the evidence, analyze the filings, and determine what is actually supported by the law and the record before it. And that brings everything back to Judge Lewis Lyman. No matter how aggressively either side argues its position or how large the request may be, the final decision rests with the court alone. Given the attention this filing has already attracted, the ruling on these legal fees is expected to become one of the most closely watched moments in the entire lawsuit. Sometimes the biggest courtroom battles aren't won by the loudest claims. They're decided by whether the numbers can withstand the judge's scrutiny.
In the entire case.
Asking for $7.5 million worth of attorney's fees and $500,000 worth of costs for the dismissal of one claim is embarrassing.
Blake Lively's $8 million fee request isn't just being challenged because of the price tag, it's the paperwork behind it that's now under the microscope. As legal observers dug deeper into the filing, many argued the controversy shifted from how much was requested to how it was justified. According to the motion, Blake's attorneys contended they weren't required to submit detailed billing records showing every hour worked. Instead, they relied on prior case law, arguing that courts have discretion to award attorneys' fees based on sworn declarations from counsel rather than itemized timesheets. That argument quickly became one of the most debated parts of the entire motion. While many legal experts agree judges can exercise that kind of discretion in certain circumstances, they also point out that multimillion-dollar fee requests are typically expected to be supported by enough evidence to demonstrate the charges are reasonable. That's why attorneys and court watchers immediately began questioning whether the filing contained sufficient documentation for such a substantial request. After all, when someone asks a court to award millions in legal fees, people naturally want to know how the total was calculated, what legal work was performed, how many hours were involved, and which members of the legal team completed those tasks. Those questions became even more significant because the filing attributed nearly $5.2 million of the request to what the attorneys described as intertwined work, meaning legal work they argued applied to multiple claims throughout the litigation. The concept itself isn't unusual. Lawyers often perform work that overlaps across different issues in the same case. But many commentators argue that overlapping work still needs to be explained clearly enough for the court to understand how the final figure was reached. As a result, attention quickly shifted away from the headline number and toward the evidence supporting it. Critics questioned how the hours were calculated, which specific legal tasks were included, and how those hours were allocated across the various claims. Ultimately, only Judge Lewis Lyman can decide whether the explanation meets the legal standard. But one thing is already clear. The documentation behind Blake's request has become almost as controversial as the $8 million figure itself, proving that in court, the biggest number means very little if the supporting evidence can't withstand scrutiny.
The problem is that they're being so really opaque and just kind of shady about it, of what this work is. Because if you're not transparent, you're hiding something, right?
Blake Lively's $8 million legal fee request may sound massive, but the real battle has shifted to one simple question: how much of it is actually recoverable? Once legal commentators began separating the fees they believe were directly tied to defending the defamation claim, the portion some argue may qualify for reimbursement under California law, the numbers looked dramatically different. According to those analyses, the potentially recoverable amount was estimated at roughly $346,885, a fraction of the $8 million Blake requested. That enormous gap instantly became one of the hottest debates surrounding the case. Critics argue that if only a limited share of the legal work is eligible for reimbursement, the remaining fees may not qualify at all. Whether the court ultimately agrees is still unknown, but the comparison prompted many observers to examine the filing far more closely. Public discussion quickly shifted from the headline figure to the legal foundation behind it. Some attorneys have also speculated that even if Judge Louis Lyman awards attorneys' fees, the final amount could be substantially lower than what's currently being discussed. Those opinions remain speculative, and only the court can determine the proper award after reviewing the evidence and applying the LAW. To this point, the conversation is no longer centered on an $8 million demand. It's about whether the claimed billing entries are legally recoverable, how those figures were calculated, and whether the evidence supports them. Whatever the court ultimately decides, this ruling could become one of the defining moments of the entire lawsuit, because in the end, it's not the size of the claim that matters most, but whether it can survive judicial scrutiny.
Big law calculation is this judge is going to see 8 million. Baldoni's going to come in and say it's worth about 50 cents.
Was Blake Lively's $8 million legal fee request really about winning in court, or winning the headline? That's the question fueling debate as more people dissect the strategy behind the filing. According to one theory circulating among legal commentators, Blake and her legal team may have recognized from the outset that recovering the full amount would be difficult. Instead, some observers believe the enormous figure guaranteed attention, dominating social media and entertainment news long before any judge issued a final ruling. After all, most people remember the headline, while far fewer ever read the court's final decision or the legal reasoning behind it. From that perspective, critics argue the filing may have served a public relations purpose as much as a legal one. But that approach may have produced an unexpected result. Rather than accepting the $8 million figure at face value, attorneys, legal analysts, and even members of the public began examining the filing line by line, reviewing the calculations, questioning the legal basis, and testing whether the requested fees were actually supported by the evidence. As that scrutiny intensified, the conversation shifted away from the headline itself and toward the numbers behind it. Instead of asking why Blake requested $8 million, many observers began asking whether the filing actually justified that amount. Once the focus turned to the supporting documentation rather than the publicity surrounding the request, every calculation came under far closer examination. Ultimately, Judge Louis Lyman will decide whether any attorney's fees are warranted and, if so, how much should be awarded. Whatever the ruling, it won't just determine the outcome of this motion. It may ultimately decide whether this filing is remembered as a bold legal strategy or a headline that couldn't survive careful scrutiny.